you've mentioned a couple of times that some of your theologian friends think of the modern era as a mistake.
That's right. Yeah.
And we should basically go back to the values of the pre-modern era. Well, I mean, one response to that is this is extremely unrealistic, but leaving that aside, I do think there's something important about the autonomy as a moral political value,
Yeah.
and the uniqueness of our own minds, which we did not get in the pre-modern period.
Hey, welcome back to another episode of Parker's Pensées. This is a podcast where we explore all the deepest ideas in philosophy, theology, nature, and life. I love thinking about cool stuff, so come think with me. Today's episode is a very special episode. I have with me Dr. Linda Zagzebski, and she's coming back on the podcast. So she's already been on once to talk about omni-subjectivity and whether God knows our subjective states in a similar manner that we do, or in the same way. Go watch that episode as well. But today we're going to be talking a little bit different topics here. We're going to be talking about her new book, The Two Greatest Ideas, and that's how our grasp of the universe and our minds changed everything. And it's kind of like a history of ideas book, which I'm really excited about. I really enjoy it. She did a great job researching as well. And then she's done some constructive work at the end too that I'm really pumped to talk about, how we might go about reconciling the objective and subjective perspectives for ourselves. It's really fascinating. I have 2 books to give away as well. So there's my copy. You're not getting that one. It's got all my notes. But these 2 fresh copies. I'm not super great with promo stuff, but I figured we'll do a giveaway for all those who are subscribing to my Substack. So go and subscribe to my Substack. You can find the link in the description wherever you're getting this episode at. And next week we will be doing a drawing. So I'll generate 2 random numbers and pick from the subscribers. So subscribe to my Substack. You can get all my stuff directly to your email there. That'd be awesome. And 2 of you are getting free books. So that'll be awesome. Another way, that's a good way to support the podcast, is subscribing to my Substack. Another way is to support me on Patreon. You can find the link in the description as well. If you like this podcast, if it's your top 5, top 10, top 15, if you want to see this continue, please consider becoming a Patreon patron. You can join for as little as $3 a month, all the way up to like $100 a month. That's huge. That's the best way to support the podcast. But another way to support would be to buy some merch, and that also supports the artists I work with. So you can find that stuff. If you're on YouTube, you can click to my YouTube store. You can find the link to the Parker's Pensées merch shop in the description as well. There's so much self-promotion to do. It's unreal. But let's stop there and let's bring in Dr. Linda Zagzebski, and let's talk about the 2 greatest ideas. Linda, thanks so much for coming back on the podcast.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation.
Yeah. So this book is really fascinating. I was actually reading another piece by you for my epistemology class with Brendan Rickabaugh at PBA. It's your essay, I believe it's called What is Knowledge? And so I've been getting a lot of you lately, a lot of your voice in my head. But this idea is different. It's not necessarily like straight up philosophy. It's like history of ideas type stuff.
Yes.
Before we get into the 2 greatest ideas, what they are, how about like what's the impetus for writing this type of book?
Well, I've reached an age when I've started thinking about the history of my work in philosophy, how the ideas might fit together.
Mhm.
I have taught history of philosophy for decades. I also have an amateur interest in the history of art and literature. And so I started thinking about whether there are connections in the history of art and literature and philosophy, and how I might go about thinking about what has driven the history to the point we are now.
Yeah.
And so I got the idea for the book. I don't know how I got the idea. Most ideas just come into your head.
Yeah.
But once I got the idea of these 2 greatest ideas and the interplay between them, many pieces in the history of thought, history of philosophy, art, literature, moral and political thought, seem to come together into a coherent story. The book, as you say, is not a book that's strictly philosophy. It's history of ideas, so it's different from other things I've written. And it's also unconventional in that it's a big picture idea. That I don't think is very fashionable these days. But that's what I'm trying to do. And so what I propose is that there are these two great ideas. The first is the idea that the human mind can grasp the universe, meaning everything there is.
Yeah.
And the second is the idea that the human mind can grasp itself. And I argue that the first great idea dominated for thousands of years until the early modern period. And then the second great idea became dominant and everything changed in every field.
Yeah.
And so that's what the book is about. And then I also argue that both of these ideas are still within us as individuals and as a society. And they don't have a very easy, they're not harmonious.
Yeah.
They don't go together very well in our thinking and in our culture. And so then I propose that thinking about this history will show us why we have so many confusions, both intellectual confusions and practical conflicts, political, moral conflicts. And then I propose a way forward.
Yeah.
So that's how the book, that's sort of an outline of how the book goes.
Yeah, and I really like what you said about being later in your career and looking over the whole field and trying to put things together. I really like that. As I talk with systematic theologians, oftentimes they'll say, writing a systematic theology book is for a mature theologian. Like if you're 22 years old, straight out of seminary or whatever, and you're trying to write a whole systematic theology, these things need years and years of pondering and chewing on and teaching on and reflecting on. So it's really cool that you're doing this. I'm really excited about it. I think these two ideas you mentioned in the intro, I believe, that they're almost so basic that it's like why even reflect on them? Like, yeah, okay, the mind can grasp the universe, but as I chewed on it myself, it was like, wow, this is a really fascinating idea, and to not have this idea and then to then grasp it would change everything. And you talked about why it's not necessary to think that the whole universe is uniform just because you're out there in the field harvesting corn. Maybe just that part of the universe is uniform, but to actually project that on or conceive of the whole universe as being uniform is like a pretty staggering thing. It's pretty perspective changing. Do you think that there was a time in history when people didn't have this idea, or is this idea always, do you think this is part of like the human conceptual framework and it's just been reflected on more?
Right. That's a fascinating question. I have thought about it, and I don't know if I can give a good enough answer without knowing much more than I know about history.
Yeah.
But one indication that the idea created a kind of intellectual explosion is the beginnings of ancient Greek philosophy in the pre-Socratics. So when you look at the ideas that we see in the pre-Socratics, Thales thought everything derives from water.
Right.
Anaximenes thought it was breath or air. And Anaximander thought it was something like the infinite or the boundless. I can't remember exactly what the translation is. Now, when I used to teach the pre-Socratics, students thought the idea that everything is water or air was kind of silly.
Right.
But actually, there was something about it that was pure genius. The idea that there is something that everything is.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter if it's water or air or the boundless. The very idea that they're looking for something that everything is means that they must have had the first great idea. And did people before them have the first great idea? There must have been some who did. But at least in Western philosophy, the first people of record who show quite clearly that they had the first idea would be the pre-Socratics.
Yeah.
So I give a little attention to them. And that, as we always say, started both science and philosophy, because both science and philosophy really do attempt to look for universal laws, physical laws, metaphysical laws, mathematical laws. And that urge to do so really arises from the idea that there is a unified reality. All of reality is in some sense one thing, or it's one interconnected. It's a thing with an interconnected structure.
Yeah. I love the pre-Socratics. I love Thales, and partially because I was one of those students who thought, man, this is ridiculous. All is water. Come on, man. Like, have you never seen a desk? I guess you hadn't, but a stone. Until I listened to some lectures by like Art Holmes. They're on YouTube, and he does such a great job of embodying like Thales and the person, whoever's idea he's representing. And he would motivate it by saying, well, look, you put some water in a dish and watch it dry up, and there's going to be matter there afterwards. There's little white stuff or whatever. And you just go through and see, like, I guess I could see how everything could be water. If you're just going from the pre-Socratic mentality, it's not as crazy as you think. These people are geniuses. So I really appreciated the pre-Socratic notes there, and I thought it helped me like reflect on biblical authors as well, because I'm thinking, I know some people think, maybe Aquinas thought, that some of the Greek philosophers stole from the Bible, from the Old Testament or something like that. But I was thinking, like, I wonder what Moses thought about like everything. Like, he's getting revelation from God, but it doesn't seem like anything in the Bible says here's what everything is, so you can still have these live questions. And you did this, you give this definition to demarcate philosophy from theology. Say philosophy studies what can be known by natural reason. Theology studies what revelation adds to what is known naturally. And so I thought it's just so cool that these things are still live options, even if you have a super strong view of divine revelation. What is there something that everything is? And I've been chewing on that a lot. So you motivated some pre-Socratic questions for me again, and I really appreciate that.
Well, I'm glad to hear that, and I'm glad you mentioned scripture in the Old Testament, because I definitely think that you see the first great idea in Genesis. I mean, right away in the beginnings of the Old Testament. And what's different about the form that the first great idea takes in the Hebrew scriptures versus Greek philosophy is that the Greeks thought that everything is one in a sense that can be systematized. So you can systematize mathematics, science, philosophy. You can systematize ethics. As Aristotle did. But the Hebrews thought that everything is one as a story. It's a single narrative that you can tell, or can be told in Revelation from the creation of the world. So everything is a one and it has a narrative structure. As opposed to a systematic, rational structure as the Greeks were aiming for.
I caught that later on. You brought up mythopoeic mythopoetic thinking.
Yes.
And it's understanding the world in the form of stories about personal agents. And that's something I've been thinking through myself because I'm studying philosophy and I studied theology. I'm trying to also demarcate the two and see the interconnection. And I love that way of thinking it. Theology, like you said, studies what revelation adds to what is known naturally, but it also studies that mythopoesis, the mythopoetic structure of reality. Whereas I like to think of philosophy as studying like the furniture of the story.
Mm-hmm.
So, the story has someone falling over a chair, and the philosopher is like, well, what is a chair? Do chairs exist?
Mm-hmm.
Are they real objects, or are they
Mm-hmm.
just chair-wise things? So that was really cool to think through. There's like this speculative thinking, and there's
Right.
mythopoetic
Right.
thinking. Yeah,
Right.
yeah. I also really enjoyed there's so many things that you help me think in a new light over. Um, I never really understood what Aristotle was talking about when he talked about poetry and I don't know if it's poesis in the Greek or what, but poetry.
Mm-hmm.
But you talked about this epic poetry and imaginary persons populating fantasy worlds. It's something that we take for granted today. It's all of our best movies have these things, all of our best novels. But Aristotle said that this type of poetry, of not what has been, but what could be or what possibly could be, is actually the more philosophical. And so you putting in light of like modern novels, and I thought of comic books and stuff like that as well, really helped open my eyes to what Aristotle was getting at with poetry. Because I'm like, dude, I don't understand if he's just talking about roses are red. Like that doesn't seem very philosophical to me. But you opened up a new door for me to appreciate
Mm-hmm.
Aristotle and his speculative thinking, even through poetry.
Yes, Aristotle in the Poetics makes a good contrast with the modern view of what poetry is. Of course, when he says poetry, he means anything fictional.
Yeah.
We think fiction is. And Aristotle said that the reason poetry is more philosophical than history is that poetry, the characters in poetry are universals with proper names attached.
Hmm.
And he says the character only exists for the sake of the action. The individuality of the character he thinks is unimportant.
Mm-hmm.
The character represents universals, and that's why it's philosophical.
Yeah.
Think how different that is from the way we think ever since the rise of the modern novel.
Mm-hmm.
We think of the characters in novels as being unique individuals, just like you and I are.
Mm-hmm.
We think of them as having particular interesting personalities.
Yeah.
They do not represent universals.
Mm.
And we think that we can, in a sense, get into the head of a character in a novel or a film and see the world through their eyes, which we take to be distinctive, different from everybody else.
Yeah.
And that simply is not done in epic poetry, Greek tragedies. So there is the difference between thinking of the world as a whole and thinking of our place in the world as being simply the way a particular mind fits into the whole, where you understand yourself by understanding the whole. That is ancient and medieval.
Yeah.
But now we tend to think that the individual mind comes first. The individual mind has primacy. We figure out what the universe is by reflecting on the contents of our mind. That is completely different.
Yeah.
And what I argue in the book is that when the second great idea, the idea that the human mind can grasp itself, became dominant, there were changes in everything. Like you've mentioned, the change in literature. There were changes in art, in philosophy, starting with Descartes. Modern science started, and there were changes in moral and political thought as well.
Yeah, it's so fascinating. Along the shift in dominance from the external world to the subjective world of the self, you mentioned Mikhail Bakhtin, and I thought that was so
Mhm,
cool because I've had to read some of his stuff because when I was studying theology, I was working with Kevin Van Hooser, and he pulls from him heavily, and so it was really cool to see that name brought up again. But you mentioned that Bakhtin, he links the subjective perspectives present in the novel with the fact that epistemology became dominant
mhm,
over metaphysics, and I thought that
mhm,
was such a cool take because I've heard Charles Taylor talk about some of the non-personal reasons for shifts in ideas and the history of thought and stuff, and
mhm,
a lot of times, especially in theology, people pull from Taylor, and it's like that's QED. Taylor said it, then that's that. The modern train is the reason why people
mhm.
stop going to church, but you still give this personal reason of the novel and the shift. Can you flesh that out for us a little bit more? How did the modern novel either aid, or how does Bakhtin or you think that the novel is linked to the shift from metaphysics to epistemology?
Oh, I see. Yes. Well, Bakhtin compares um, epic poetry with a novel.
Mm,
And one of the interesting things he says is that in the epic poem, there's no difference between the interior of the character and the exterior. Everything is externalized.
yeah.
Um, so what you are is the way you are perceived. It could be perceived by the chorus in the tragedy, but you are as you are perceived and are you as you are thought to be in your society.
Mm,
Your interior is transparent.
yeah.
There really isn't any important interior to the character. Whereas in the novel, it's just the opposite. The interior of the character is not only important, sometimes it's the whole story.
That's right. Yeah.
And so the that means that um, how we think from the point of view of our own minds comes first. Um, what the world is as a whole, metaphysics, comes second.
Mhm.
So epistemology precedes metaphysics. This is not actually what Bakhtin said,
Yeah.
but I think it's implied, and it's part of what I'm saying in my story, is that epistemology comes first. Well, when you think that the way we know starts with our own minds.
Mm,
And then you can see this in the modern rationalists as well as the empiricists,
yeah.
that, you see this in Descartes and Locke. We start with our own minds. We figure out what the world is outside of our minds by reflecting on the contents of our minds.
Mhm.
And that means that um, metaphysics had to be, how shall I put it? Grand metaphysical schemes were no longer in fashion.
Yeah.
Because when you start with the contents of your own mind, your first problem is skepticism. Can
Mhm.
you get outside your mind to know anything about the exterior world? And then do that, what when you put together the contents of your mind is much, much more modest
Yeah, that's right.
than what you get if you are doing, if you're like Aristotle or Aquinas,
Mhm.
or even in the early modern period in Spinoza or
Yeah.
Leibniz. I
Yeah.
mean, they had big schemes, but those fell out of philosophical fashion fairly quickly.
Mhm.
And so that's basically, I think, the idea that I'm talking about there.
Yeah. Again, I was so fascinated by that, and it made some connections I'm really intrigued by the idea of the authorial analogy for the God-world relation, that God relates to the world in an analogous fashion to an author and their novel. And
Oh, yes, that's a good point. Yeah.
yeah, and so I love that. But I wondered to myself, why, if this was such a good analogy, why wasn't it used more throughout church history? They talk about the book of nature, but they rarely would talk about God as like this genius author. And this guy, this theologian Frederick Christian Bauerschmidt, talks about the rise of the modern novel, and that had to be invented in order for us to then see the author as this creative genius, and so then to make that connection
I
to
see.
God. And,
Yes.
and so it
Yes.
tracks the same story of the modern novel, but from the theological perspective. So again,
Hmm.
just so many connections from this book that I really enjoyed. And while the novel and the rise of the novel is linked with it, you're careful not to say it caused or anything like that. But you do mention Descartes a lot, and everyone always points to Descartes as as a pretty clear indicator that we're making this shift from objective to subjective, from metaphysics to epistemology. Um, just real quick, like on a personal note, is Descartes a bad guy? Is he like, is it his fault that we're all trapped up in subjectivism, or would someone
No,
else have
not
come
at
along?
all.
Okay.
I mean, I see him as just one of the um, inventors of the idea that the second great idea comes first, the idea
Mm,
that our grasp of our own minds comes first.
yeah.
So the first modern novel, Cervantes' Don Quixote,
Hmm.
which is universally accepted as one of the greatest works of fiction ever written, that preceded Descartes.
Yeah.
And so the revolution in literature preceded the revolution in philosophy,
Mm,
and the revolution in art also preceded it.
yeah.
So in the Renaissance, in 15th century Florence, the Arab invention of perspective was brought and used to magnificent effect, both in painting and in architecture and in changes in optics and navigation. I mean, it was the discovery of perspective had enormous cultural ramifications.
Hmm.
In art, what I find particularly interesting is that the art of the Renaissance not only became more realistic because of the discovery of perspective, of principles of perspective, but it also showed people differences in point of view.
Mm,
So the artist could choose a particular point of view in the painting, could represent it. It could be identified or recognized by viewers as a particular point of view, and that point of view could change from artist to artist or from person to person. So it gave people the idea of the existence of points of view, the differences from each other, and how those differences are important.
mhm.
So the modern idea of the differences in subjective perspective and different points of view can partly be traced to the idea or the use of perspective in art prior to Descartes. And so I think that the revolution in art and literature actually preceded the revolution in philosophy. The revolution in science accompanied the revolution in philosophy.
Mm.
And Descartes clearly says that he's aiming to give science a firm foundation.
Yeah, his full
And
the full
philosophy.
title of his book, right? It just adds
Mhm.
that super duper long, but yeah, it adds scientific knowledge.
Right.
Yeah. Um, yeah, that's so cool. I meant to ask this later, but it's naturally popping up right now. With art and literature preceding the movements in philosophy, some people will use that and say, well, they won't use this language, but as philosophers, maybe we can. They'll say something like, philosophers or philosophies are nomological danglers. They just come afterwards, right? They don't have any they're not actively shaping culture. They're just the result of culture, and culture shapes philosophy. Do you have any thoughts on that? Like the interplay between philosophy and culture? Are philosophers genuinely shaping culture
Well,
in
I
big shapes?
definitely think philosophers are shaping culture. This actually is a sort of the opposite extreme from the question you asked before. I mean, you asked before, can we blame Descartes for everything in the modern period? And I said, well, no, because there's revolutions in art and literature and science, in addition to the revolution in philosophy. But now you're saying maybe philosophy doesn't do anything except follow along the revolutions in other parts of culture. And no, I mean, I don't know exactly how to put it, but Descartes and Locke, both rationalists and empiricists, just to pick two important ones,
Uh-huh.
are still widely studied and widely influential.
Mm.
Even though maybe if you ask a person on the street, how important do you think Descartes is? They might say, oh, I don't know, who's Descartes?
Hmm.
But yet their own thinking was influenced and shaped by views of philosophers in the early modern period, and still continuing. So,
Yeah.
and another important example of the change in culture with the switch from the dominance of the first great idea to the dominance of the second great idea is in moral and political thought.
Mm-hmm.
And that does touch very closely to what ordinary people who are not philosophers think about the world and about themselves. So one of the switches then was from the idea that the human being should live, the moral way to live is in harmony with their nature, which is a part of nature as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
So that morality is living in harmony with God or nature, or both together. That was the dominant idea in the pre-modern era.
Mm-hmm.
But with the rise of the second great idea and the view that we first grasp our own minds and then grasp what the world is, that led to the idea that I direct my thoughts. I direct my thoughts. I am the ultimate authority over my thoughts.
Mm.
I direct my thoughts. And when I direct my thoughts, I will, with luck, come up with some views or some ideas about what the world is like. But my ability to direct my thoughts is the primary moral authority. The primary moral authority is not the world as a whole or nature. The primary authority is autonomy, myself, and my ability to govern myself. So we got to switch from the idea that morality is living in harmony with nature to the idea that morality is grounded in the self's ability to direct itself.
Mm.
And that not only changed morality, it changed political thought, because if the primary authority is autonomy, then political structures need to be based on the agreement of self-governing autonomous selves.
Yeah.
So we get a switch in politics and political social structures. We get a switch in political theory to explain that, as well as a switch in moral theory with the rise of the second great idea.
Yeah, it's so fascinating to think about, because with if autonomy is the highest authority or good, then yeah, we need to set up this government in order to maximize that. But if you switch that around, then you play an important role in society, and that's what gives your life meaning. Is how are you helping
Hmm.
the common good? And yeah, I mean, I don't know. It's overly. I don't want to be overly simplistic, but you can see that even playing out between communism and capitalism, and just different underlying structures and philosophies undergirding those. And I'm sure it's so complicated in what you're talking about, this kind of capitalism or that kind of socialism or communism. So it's just fascinating to go super broad view and see the different perspectives and distinctives that are emphasized from moving from one great idea to the second greatest idea. So cool. I love this framework.
Yes, well, I guess what I would add to what you said is that if you just take our own society,
Hmm.
you see the clash between um, the idea that morality is living in harmony
Yeah.
with the world around us, and versus morality as autonomy. You
Hmm.
see this clash in more communitarian ideas about society versus very individualistic ones.
Yeah.
And I actually think that both the value of harmony and the value of autonomy are in us as individuals and in us as a society. We have both values.
Yeah.
The problem is we haven't figured out how to put them together very well.
Yeah.
And I think we can actually trace a lot of the hot button political issues that we face today to a clash between these two values.
Hmm.
But the two values don't actually line up with um, the standard left versus right political positions.
Yeah.
So, like, autonomy is usually the main value that's appealed to by people who support abortion.
Hmm.
But it's also the value that people referred to when they were resisting COVID shutdowns or
Yeah.
vaccine mandates.
Yeah.
Yet one tends to be left and the other tends to be right, but they're both the value of
Yeah.
autonomy.
Or gun
Um,
rights. Yeah. Another
yeah.
one. Yeah.
And so, I mean, there's a lot of political issues that I mention in the book. Um, Another one that doesn't seem to line up with the political divisions is environmental concerns.
Yeah. I was just thinking about
So, environmental concerns really cannot be addressed adequately with the value of autonomy.
that.
They really require a first grade idea view about the importance of living in harmony with nature.
Yeah.
And yet those tend to be done by left leaning people,
Hmm.
and the resistance to it on the grounds of autonomy tend to be, come from right leaning people. So I think the left versus right division is very unhelpful,
Hmm.
and just leads to further confusions and further polarization. And what we really should think about are these two ideas and the values that we have inherited from them.
Yeah.
And that I think is something we haven't done yet.
Yeah. Um, Another thing I like in the book is that you treat these two ideas, like you're doing here, as equal goods. And so it's oftentimes I'll hear, mm, maybe I'll throw my theologian friends under the bus. Theologians saying, talking up the pre-modern perspective, and that's the way to go, and that's where we need to go back. And you just ask them the same questions that Descartes asked, and it's like, well, have you sufficiently answered Descartes? Because if not, then you
Mm-hmm.
can't just ignore him. You can't just pretend like he didn't exist. You can't just go back to the good old days of the pre-moderns. You still have to answer these same questions. So what I appreciate about what you've done here, Linda, is that you prop them both up and say both of these are good. Both, we just have to figure out how to bring them both together. And so I thought it was a really balanced take on both the first greatest idea and the second. Neither
Yes.
one is evil or anything like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, you've mentioned a couple of times that some of your theologian friends think of the modern era as a mistake.
That's right. Yeah.
And we should basically go back to the values of the pre-modern era. Well, I mean, one response to that is this is extremely unrealistic, but leaving that aside, I do think there's something important about the autonomy as a moral political value,
Yeah.
and the uniqueness of our own minds, which we did not get in the pre-modern period. I think that individual uniqueness rests in our subjectivity, and the discovery of subjectivity was one of the greatest discoveries in human history. And it does explain why each individual person is irreplaceable. In the pre-modern era, the value that gave humans dignity was their rationality. Yeah. We're made in the image of God. That would be the religious version of it. And what God gave us as our greatest gift is rationality. And that value was the value that we see throughout the ancient and medieval period as being what makes us special. Yeah. What gives us special dignity. But when you think about rationality is a shareable quality. Mm-hmm. It isn't what makes you and I distinct or different from each other. It's what makes us the same.
And we can have it to various degrees too, right? So if someone isn't rational, it's tricky. People always point to this and say, well, look, if someone's less rational or something, are they less an image bearer of God? No one wants to say that. No, that's crazy.
Right. Yeah. And when you start talking about rationality coming in degrees, that's very dangerous, because then it's human beings get respect in different degrees and have rights in different degrees.
Crazy.
And stuff like that. So I think that, I've argued in other places that there are two senses of dignity. Mm-hmm. One is what gives us supreme value, or very high value, and the other is what gives us the value of irreplaceability, and they're not the same thing. Mm-hmm. So rationality is, as I see it, is the ground of what makes us special in the universe as a whole, as a species, and it's what gives us high value in the universe. And it's a value that comes from the first great idea. Where do we fit in the universe as a whole? But I see subjectivity, our individual unique subjectivity, as what the ground of our irreplaceability. It's what makes it a loss to the universe. If one of us dies, there's a loss to the universe. We're irreplaceable. We're not irreplaceable because we're rational. We're irreplaceable because we are distinctive persons with unique subjectivity. So I think the discovery of subjectivity was extremely important in explaining what gives human beings a distinctive kind of value.
Yeah, that's huge. Following up on rationality, just briefly, it gives us our high value. Is that value, is it a qualitatively distinct value from the rest of creation, or is it quantitative? We're more rational than the apes, but the apes are decently rational, so they're more value. Or is it we're in a whole different realm, and rationality is this qualitatively different thing?
Well, there are different points of view about that.
Sure.
And my point in the book, and what I was just saying, is rationality isn't the right kind of thing to explain irreplaceability of persons.
Mm-hmm.
But you asked about the value of rationality, and Well, I mean, there certainly were eras when it was thought that human rationality puts us above the rest of creation. We are in a separate category from the rest of creation. It's more common now to think of rationality as coming in degrees. Dolphins and apes and birds seem to be pretty rational in some ways. So I can't speak to all the examples of other animals, but it does look like other animals are more rational than we thought. That part sounds right.
Yeah.
And whether that means that they are, do partial respect or have partial dignity, I don't know how to answer that.
Yeah. That's a tough one. Well, you in the book you bring up Fichte, post-Kantian thinker. I used to be really, really intrigued by Fichte, and I've let it go for a while, so I'm not as up to date. But because of his self-consciousness, his emphasis on self-consciousness and awareness, and I wonder if maybe that's a way to further elucidate or further flesh out the uniqueness that self-consciousness incorporates both rationality and subjectivity. Do you think that's right?
Well, I'm not sure how to answer the question because I'm not sure I understand the question as you're asking it very clearly. Self-consciousness is mysterious.
Yeah.
Because in every other kind of consciousness, we have a distinction between the subject and the object. In self-consciousness, I mean, you can think of yourself as an object.
Yeah.
But self-consciousness isn't always that way. The subject and object are the same thing. Augustine said in more than one place, actually, in the Confessions, that the mind is always aware of itself.
Yeah.
It's like it's something you carry with you all the time. So, I mean, you can focus on it or not as you choose, but there's a sense in which you're always self-conscious. He doesn't use that term, but you could interpret it that way. And so self-consciousness can be understood as something that's automatic.
Yeah.
But we are able to reflect on ourselves. And when we do that, we turn ourselves into an object. And this is not a bad thing because we need to reflect upon ourselves in order to judge ourselves, in order to evaluate ourselves, in order to say, oh, I think my memory of that event was mistaken. I mean, having the memory is an event in my consciousness, but reflecting on it and saying, no, that was wrong, requires thinking of separating myself from the memory in a sense and evaluating it and say, no, it was mistaken.
Yeah.
Or I think that belief, I'm not sure that belief is true. Or maybe my emotion was too intense. We do that kind of thing all the time, and we need to do that in order to govern ourselves.
Yeah.
So if autonomy really is an important value, we need to do a good job of governing ourselves. And in order to do a good job of governing ourselves, our self-consciousness has to switch. We have self-consciousness in a sense automatically, the way Augustine said, but we need to be able to switch back and forth between being in a conscious state, a subjective state, and reflecting on that state and evaluating it.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not sure how to connect this with what Fichte said.
Yeah.
I'm not an expert on Fichte, so I don't, I don't have a lot to say about it. But there is a mystery about what the I is, the capital I, not EYE, what the I is. And he really brought to philosophical attention the fact that actually undergirds most of our philosophical issues.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so fascinating. I grabbed two two of his arguments from your book.
Okay.
And he just said that, he argued that unless we possessed an immediate acquaintance with ourselves, we would never know that when we turn our attention to ourselves in reflection, what we are aware of is our own self rather than an external object.
Yes, I'm glad you remembered that.
Yeah.
That I found that very illuminating.
Definitely. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, there is the immediate awareness of the self. And then when we reflect on the self, we may turn it into an object, as I just said, but we know it's the same thing.
Yeah.
We know it's this. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and so then he follows up furthermore, unless the self were always acquainted with itself, there would be no explanation for what would motivate the self to turn to itself in self-reflection. There
Mhm.
would have to be some awareness of a self in order to know that there is something there to look at, and where to look. And so maybe memory or something, you have memory of yourself, but you'd still have to have this kind of self-knowledge or self-knowledge in order to turn back to the self in reflection, like you were saying, when we're reflecting on our memories or our beliefs and looking at them in an objective perspective. It's just, I thought that was so fascinating. And you mentioned that there's this huge span of time between Augustine and Fichte where people weren't really addressing this. And so I thought that was cool. And that reminded me of why I was interested in him in the first place.
Yes. And I think I also discussed that in the section on the ancient question, can the eye see itself?
Yes, that's right.
And so many people find it curious that the eye cannot see itself, except in mirrors, which is not the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
So, and then the question was what follows from that, of course. But in a sense, both Augustine and Fichte are saying the eye can see itself. The eye is always aware of itself.
Yeah.
It doesn't see itself from the outside, or if it did, then it's not the same thing. Right. But what Fichte is saying, yes, and Augustine, the eye is aware of itself. And then if it turns around and looks at itself, it knows it's the same thing.
It's so cool when it kind of freaks me out a little bit to talk about this kind of stuff, because it's so fascinating and it's so cool, and it's something that's just take it for granted in all of our experience. And so when you kind of reflect back on it, it's a little bit, to me, it's like it's awe-inspiring, but it's also terrifying because I just think, like, what if I were a dog right now and I wouldn't have these experiences? So like there's this kind of luck situation where I'm like, man, I'm glad that this conscious thing that I am is capable of, and maybe necessarily self-conscious and self-aware. It's such a fascinating thing that we're human beings, of course we are, but you make this distinction between the person and the self. And man, I'm just glad I'm a self-conscious person. It's really a privilege and a crazy responsibility as well, but it's fascinating.
Yes, thank you. And I guess what I was saying about the difference between the person and the self is that the self is the inside of the person.
Yeah.
And when we give theories of the universe as a whole, we talk about persons and where they are in the world. Here's how they interact or relate to other parts of the created world. But the self is the inside of the person.
Yeah.
And once the inside of the person became important philosophically, and I think theologically, that changed a lot of things.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so much so that it's almost it's pretty difficult to imagine what people thought about before they had this kind of perspective that we have. It's because it's so part of who we are. Well, so I wanted to move on to the solution that you have for the problem between the objective and subjective. Like, we have these two perspectives. They can wreak havoc in our politics. They can wreak havoc in our own conception of the world by not fitting them together. But you give this solution, and I have the 3 steps here. If you wanted me to read those, or if you just have them on the top of your mind, you can.
Well, why don't you read them and then I'll just comment on them.
Definitely. Awesome. Okay, so you say for step number 1, begin by forming your total objective conception of reality. So you have this conception of reality. You start with that. Then step 2, you turn your state of awareness of having this total conception of objective reality. Well, you call it a TOC. You turn your state of awareness of having a TOC into an object by reflecting on it. And then 3, you fit that object of reflection back into your total conception of reality, your TOC. So you start with the subjective, even though it might sound confusing for people because you're taking your total objective conception of reality, but that is subjective because that's your conception of reality. But then you reflect on it and you turn it into like the object of your thought. So if you have like a thought bubble, you're thinking about this thought bubble now, and then you're fitting that into your whole conception of the world. Does that sound right?
Well, the only thing I would change on what you said is that the total objective conception is objective. It's not subjective. So the
Okay.
way I'm thinking it, you start with a total objective conception, and I'm being neutral on what that is. You pick.
Okay. Okay.
You
Yeah, I
pick
remember
what
you
it
saying that.
is.
Yeah.
It could be Aristotelian Thomistic. It could be
Yeah, monism or whatever.
Hegelian. I don't care. Whatever it is, you
Right.
start with a total objective conception, and your awareness of that conception is not in the conception because your
Okay.
awareness is subjective.
I thought the conception was doing some work there and making it subjective, but I get what you're saying now.
Yeah. So you start with an objective conception.
Okay.
Pick any philosophical view you like. I mean, you could pick anything you want, but some will work better than others. That's
Yeah.
what's going to happen. Okay. So you start with your total objective conception, but your awareness of that conception, you're having that conception, is not in the conception because it's a subjective state.
Gotcha.
Now, to be total, that awareness has to be in it, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the total objective conception is missing something. It's missing your awareness of it.
Yeah.
So then I suggest using, the Fichte move. You then become aware of your awareness as an object.
Mm-hmm.
You turn your awareness of the TOC into an object by reflecting on it.
Yeah.
And thinking about its objective properties. And then once you do that, once you can see its objective properties, you can insert that into the total objective conception.
Yeah.
That was the idea, how you turn your subjective states into objects by reflection. Once you do that, you insert them into the total objective conception. Now, sometimes it won't work because the total objective conception you start with isn't good enough.
Yeah.
And that's, so this is very schematic. It's not like I've actually done it. It's a sort of a recipe for what people could do in the future in attempting to put subjectivity into an objective conception.
Yeah. And I appreciate this. I think we mentioned off air that Josh Rasmussen is working on something like this as well in his new book, Who Are You Really? And so if the audience wants to go check out our episode, you can find that as well. And we talk about it. It also is reminiscent of like Nagel's The View from Nowhere.
Yes,
where,
of course, yes.
And he's just hammering people and I don't know if you call them modernists or what, but these people who are saying like, we just need the objective perspective. And Nagel's like, well, you're missing billions of subjective perspectives, which actually are part of reality. So reality is more than objective reality. It's also a subjective reality. And that's what you're doing with that third step. I just think that's so cool. Yeah, it's great.
Well, let me say one thing about that since you mentioned Nagel. So Nagel concludes that nobody has satisfactorily put the objective and subjective perspectives together.
Yeah.
They, ignore one or the other and pretend they're not, I guess.
Right.
And so I think that's right. And but I think that if we look at the two greatest ideas, we'll see a third idea that ought to be one of the greatest.
Mm-hmm.
And if it was, we would be able to get past this impasse between the subjective and objective perspectives.
Yeah.
And so this is what I suggest in the last chapter. The first greatest idea is the idea that the human mind can grasp the universe. The second greatest idea is the idea that the human mind can grasp itself. But if you look at those two ideas together, you'll notice a gap. The human mind can also grasp other minds.
Yeah.
And what I say is that even though that idea has been studied in neurobiology and psychology, in phenomenology, in various religious practices. I mean, that idea has been studied, and of course, it's expressed vividly in literature, as we were talking about before, in film. We're sharing in other minds when we watch a film.
Yeah.
So even though that idea appears in many parts of our culture, they're not connected, so that we don't have a unified view of how minds intersect with other minds. And what I think we need is a revolution in intersubjectivity that's comparable to the scientific revolution in understanding the objective world. That if we had a revolution in intersubjectivity, it would have to tie together all the different pieces of work on empathy and other forms of intersubjectivity that people have worked on. I mean, phenomenology made it a wonderful attempt 100 years ago, but it didn't rise to the level of cultural importance that we saw in Descartes, for example, and in the scientific revolution. So we need a revolution in intersubjectivity. And I think if we had such a revolution, we would be able to tie together the two greatest ideas. And we might even be able to get past our extreme polarizing conflicts, practical conflicts, by seeing through each other's eyes.
Yeah.
So that's what I suggest.
Yeah. And again, I really appreciate this book because you're hitting on so many things that I'm interested in. Donald Davidson tried, I believe, this to broach the objective and subjective with the intersubjective perspective through his triangulation argument. So the reason we have concepts in speech is because we've triangulated, we've learned our concepts, we've acquired them through this triangular process of learning from our parents. So then we've solved the problem of other minds and external world because we have concepts. And people, for various reasons, think that it didn't work. But I love the attempt, and I'm so pumped that you're also ringing the bell that we need to have this, not just for philosophical speculative thought, which to me would be enough, but also because it could have cultural ramifications that could heal some rifts between people. With that in mind, I one last question.
Okay.
We talked about how Descartes can't be blamed for everything, but he could be blamed for some, meaning like his ideas were influential. I think that's definitely true. You can look at the movie Blade Runner, and like one of the pinnacles of the movie is "I think, therefore I am." So yeah, art does borrow from philosophy as well. But I wonder about today and what you think about the role, the impact that philosophers have in the academy on the culture more broadly. Like,
I
can we
see.
start? Do you
Yes.
still have
Okay.
impact? Can we
So
still
you're
do it?
not asking about Descartes. You're asking
No.
about philosophers who are alive today
Yeah,
and
about
whether
Dr.
they're
Linda here.
able
Yeah.
to impact the culture.
Right.
Well, I don't see much
Mm.
evidence that philosophers today in the US are impacting the culture, although it's possible if we could learn to write in a way that appeals to the ordinary person.
Yeah.
I mean, I noticed in Britain, there's more interest in philosophy, current, contemporary philosophy,
Yeah.
among ordinary educated people. So I'm not sure what to say.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't, I mean, I could say that people are, the culture is getting degraded by, social media and the silliest of movies and stuff like that. But on the other hand, as I mentioned a minute ago, it's partly the fault of the philosophers for not knowing how to reach them.
Yeah.
So, and it isn't just philosophers that don't reach ordinary people. Most of academia doesn't. I mean, that's probably why academia is in disrepute in the culture, because nobody talks to them, So so I'm not sure what to say exactly.
Yeah. It seems like the psychologists somehow figured out how to get their language out into
Oh, maybe. Yeah,
the
that's
world.
right.
But it's not like we understand what those words mean. We just picked them up in our popular parlance and we throw them around. But yeah, I think of like Philip K. Dick. I know he wasn't like strictly a professional philosopher or anything like that, but he did a great job of sneaking in philosophical ideas into his literature, and maybe that's part of it. Maybe philosophers need to write more novels or something. But
Right.
I'd love to. That's part of
Make
the
movies. They need to make
exactly.
movies.
Well, and that's part of the reason why I'm doing the podcast, because I think that
Yes.
I love philosophers, I love theologians, and I want to get your
Yes.
guys' ideas out there. So if I could just
Good.
promote the book one more time, it is The Two Greatest Ideas: How Our Grasp of the Universe and Our Minds Changed Everything. And man, if you guys have been encouraged by this, then take up the mantle of intersubjectivity. We got objective, subjective. Now let's get to work on intersubjective, and let's heal the culture through philosophy. Linda, thanks so much for the books, and
Thank you.
thanks for coming back on the podcast.
All right. Thank you so much.
One last thing is I believe that you're working on the intersubject or omnisubjectivity book. Is that still in process? Is that coming anytime
Oh,
soon?
yes, it's definitely in process.
Okay.
It should be delivered by the end of the year.
Fantastic.
But I'm still revising.
Okay.
And I really like it, and it's getting a lot of reaction already.
Okay.
So
that's fantastic.
So yeah.
Awesome. Well, I'm excited for that one too, and we'll have to have you back on to talk about that as well.
Okay.
Awesome. All right. Well, that's going to do it for now, folks. This has been Parker's Pensées, and as always, all glory to God.